Number 1. Axel Rudakubana. She walked into what should have been a safe, joyful place, a children's dance class in Southport. But within minutes, the music and laughter gave way to screams, and the town was left facing one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory. Axel Rudakubana was only 18 years old at the time. On the surface, there was little to set him apart. He was a teenager living in the UK, with no long trail of notoriety behind him. Friends described him as quiet, not particularly outgoing. He had no real presence in school circles or local communities. Unlike so many headline-making figures, his story did not begin with long-standing public recognition. That lack of notoriety made what happened in July 2024 even harder to comprehend. On the afternoon of July 29th, a dance class was underway at a community center in Southport, Merseyside. It was the kind of summer activity meant to keep children busy, happy, and safe during the school holidays. The group of kids, ranging from early elementary ages upward, were supervised by instructors in a bright, open hall. No one expected danger to enter that space. But just after class began, Axel approached. Carrying a knife, he entered the hall where the children were gathered. What unfolded was a brief but devastating attack. In the chaos, 3 children lost their lives: 6-year-old Bebe King, 7-year-old Elsie Stankham, and 9-year-old Alice Da Silva Aguiar. 8 more people were injured, including 5 other children. Parents and instructors rushed to shield the young students, some physically placing themselves between the attacker and the children. Within minutes, emergency calls were flooding in, and officers rushed to the scene. Imagine for a moment the shock of the first responders arriving. A dance class, children in brightly colored outfits, suddenly transformed into a crime scene. Officers subdued Rudakubana, and he was quickly taken into custody. The attack had lasted only minutes, but its impact on the town was immediate and immeasurable. Southport, a seaside community known more for its quiet beaches and family holidays than for violence, was now at the center of national grief. In the days that followed, details began to emerge. Axel had legally purchased a large knife used in the attack online. Investigators confirmed there was no prior connection between him and the children or their families. There was no feud, no personal dispute. The randomness of it all deepened the horror. Detectives pored over his phone, his social media activity, and his browsing history to understand his motive. Early reports suggested he had developed troubling interests online, including extremist content. Yet when questioned, he offered no clear explanation that could rationalize what he had done. The investigation was swift. The sheer number of witnesses, the immediate arrest, and the injuries left no room for ambiguity. Prosecutors built their case around the deliberate choice Rudakubana made: buying the weapon, planning his movements, and carrying out the attack on vulnerable victims. His defense team attempted to argue aspects of his mental health should be considered, but psychiatric assessments confirmed he was fit to stand trial. The trial began in late 2024. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, clutching photos of the children whose lives were cut short. Prosecutors outlined the sequence of events with painstaking detail. They showed the premeditation behind the purchase of the knife and highlighted testimony from survivors and instructors. Each parent who took the stand drove home the devastation left behind. The defense argued for a consideration of his young age. He was, after all, only 18 at the time. But the prosecution countered that his youth was outweighed by the gravity of the crime. In January 2025, the verdict was delivered. The jury found Axel Rudakubana guilty of 3 counts of killing and multiple counts of attempted killing. The judge, in sentencing, spoke directly to the calculated nature of his actions and the scale of suffering caused. Axel was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 52 years before being eligible for parole. That means he will not even be considered for release until the year 2077, when he would be in his 70s. For the families of Bebe, Elsie, and Alice, the sentence provided a measure of justice, but not closure. no length of prison term can replace the lives lost in that community hall. For Southport, the tragedy remains a point of collective memory. The children's names are now spoken not just within their families, but across the UK, as symbols of innocence taken far too soon. And so, the story comes full circle. A teenager, barely into adulthood, carried out an act of violence so extreme that it altered the course of countless lives. A dance class meant to celebrate joy became the site of unthinkable loss. Axel Rudakubana now faces a lifetime behind bars. But for the families of the children, the question lingers. How could someone so young bring so much devastation in just a few minutes? That question may never have a satisfying answer. Number 2. Karmelo Anthony. It was a spring afternoon in Frisco, Texas. Parents lined the bleachers, cheering on their children at a high school track meet. Whistles blew, sneakers pounded the track, and for a moment it felt like any other community sports event. But in the middle of that ordinary day, a confrontation between two teenagers escalated into something no one there will ever forget. Karmelo Anthony was 17 years old. A junior in high school, he was known among classmates as competitive, sometimes quick-tempered, but never someone most imagined would cross into deadly violence. His family had moved to Texas several years earlier, and while he wasn't a star athlete, he was often present at sports meets, cheering on friends and participating socially. On paper, his life looked like that of a typical American teenager. Austin Metcalf, also 17, was his classmate. By many accounts, Austin was hardworking, respectful, and deeply involved in athletics. He was the kind of student teachers remembered for his steady attitude, and the kind of teammate others looked to for encouragement. On April 12, 2025, the two found themselves at the same track meet in Frisco, a day that began with school pride and friendly competition. But beneath the surface, tensions had been building. Witnesses later said that Anthony and Metcalf had clashed before. The exact cause was debated. Some said it was a personal rivalry. Others whispered it might have been about relationships or lingering disputes at school. What is clear is that the argument came to a head that afternoon. During a break in the events, away from the main field but still within sight of spectators, the two began to argue. Voices rose, and the tone shifted from sharp words to physical confrontation. Imagine being in the stands, watching from a distance. One moment, the two teenagers were arguing. The next, the scene turned chaotic. Anthony produced a knife he had brought with him. In front of stunned classmates and adults, he lunged at Austin. The stabbing happened quickly, and though bystanders rushed in to stop it, the injuries were catastrophic. Emergency responders were called immediately. Austin was rushed to a nearby hospital, but doctors could not save him. At just 17 years old, he died from his injuries. The shock spread instantly. Parents who had come to support their children were now shepherding them away from the field, trying to shield them from what had unfolded. Students were crying, teachers were scrambling to manage the scene, and law enforcement sealed off the area. Anthony was taken into custody on site. The weapon, a folding knife, was recovered. As news broke, the community struggled to process what had happened. A track meet, a setting that symbolized teamwork and school pride, had become the site of a killing between two classmates. Candlelight vigils were held for Austin, and tributes poured in from friends and family who described him as a gentle leader and someone with a bright future. Meanwhile, rumors about Anthony's motives swirled online and in hallways, painting him as both a hot-headed teen and a young man under deep personal stress. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses, students, coaches, and parents who had been present. Surveillance footage from the school grounds confirmed the sequence of events. The fact that Anthony had brought a knife to the meet was a central point for prosecutors. It suggested preparation, not just a spur-of-the-moment reaction. For the state of Texas, where first-degree murder carries the heaviest penalties, that detail mattered. In late April, a grand jury indicted Karmelo Anthony on a charge of first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that bringing a weapon to a school event showed clear intent. His defense team countered that the incident was a heated fight that escalated beyond his control, pointing to his young age and lack of prior violent record. They suggested the charge should be reduced to manslaughter. But the indictment stood, setting the stage for a high-profile trial. Because Anthony is 17, the case immediately raised questions about whether he would be tried as a juvenile or an adult. Texas law allows prosecutors to seek adult charges for serious crimes committed by minors. In May 2025, the court confirmed Anthony would face trial as an adult. If convicted, he could face a sentence ranging from decades in prison to life without parole. As of now, the trial is scheduled for early 2026. Until then, Anthony remains in custody at a detention facility, held without bond. His legal team continues to argue for mitigation, suggesting his mental state, immaturity, and the heat of the confrontation should weigh in. The prosecution, however, has been firm. This was a deliberate act, carried out in front of an entire community, with devastating consequences. Austin's family, still grieving, has made clear they want the maximum penalty. At memorial services, his parents spoke of a young man who dreamed of playing college sports, who had plans beyond high school, and whose absence has left a void no sentence can fill. The school district has implemented counseling programs for students who witnessed the killing, acknowledging the trauma left behind. And so, the case stands at a tense point. A teenager is gone, another teenager awaits trial, and a community is left torn between shock and the search for justice. When the trial begins in 2026, jurors will have to decide whether Karmelo Anthony's act was the split-second escalation of a fight or the planned choice of someone who brought a knife to settle a score. For now, one thing is certain. A high school track meet, once just another weekend competition, will forever be remembered in Frisco for the day it ended in tragedy. The echoes of that afternoon still hang heavy, as families wait for a courtroom to decide what comes next. Number 3. Bardia Shojaeifard. It was just after the lunch hour in Leeds, on a chilly November afternoon in 2023. Outside the gates of a primary school, children were playing, parents were gathering, and the ordinary rhythm of the day carried on. But in those few minutes, a sudden act of violence shattered the calm. Witnesses later said they saw two boys, both just 15 years old, come face to face. Within moments, one pulled out a knife. The other, a red-haired boy named Alfie Lewis, would never walk away. Bardia Shojaeifard was the one holding the knife. At the time, he was just 15, a student himself, known among classmates, but not someone who had previously attracted major public attention. He lived in Leeds with his family, and like many teenagers, his life was a mixture of school, friendships, and the pressures of adolescence. Nothing in his public profile foreshadowed that he would commit one of the most shocking youth crimes in recent years. Alfie Lewis, also 15, was his schoolmate. Described as bright, funny, and outgoing, Alfie was remembered for his distinctive red hair and his warm personality. Friends said he had a way of making people laugh, and teachers often noted his energy. On November 7, 2023, he had finished the school day and was outside, near the gates of a nearby primary school, when his life intersected fatally with Bardia's. The confrontation was sudden. Witnesses said Alfie appeared unarmed, chatting with others when Bardia approached him. Accounts suggest there had been tension between the two, typical teenage disagreements that had lingered over time. But no one expected the dispute to escalate. Then, without warning, Bardia produced a knife he had been carrying. Imagine standing nearby, parents waiting to collect their younger children, other students milling about. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. Alfie was stabbed in front of them, the scene unfolding in a matter of seconds. Despite frantic efforts to help him, Alfie collapsed. Emergency services were called immediately, and paramedics rushed him to the hospital. But the injuries were too severe. At just 15 years old, Alfie died from the stabbing. The shock rippled across Leeds. A boy killed outside a school in broad daylight. It was the kind of tragedy that made parents question the safety of even the most ordinary moments. Vigils were held in Alfie's memory, his friends laying flowers and tributes outside the school gates. His family spoke of a life cut short, of a son who was loved deeply and who had been looking forward to a future now stolen. Meanwhile, police moved quickly. Shojaeifard was arrested almost immediately after the stabbing. Officers recovered the knife and began piecing together what had led to the confrontation. During questioning, Bardia offered shifting explanations, at times downplaying his intent, at others seeming detached from the gravity of what had occurred. What became clear through the investigation was that he had brought the weapon to the scene deliberately. The decision to carry it was not spontaneous. It was planned. By early 2024, prosecutors charged him with the killing of Alfie Lewis. The trial drew national attention, not just because of the age of both boys, but because it highlighted the growing concern over knife crime among young people in the UK. In court, prosecutors laid out the sequence of events, emphasizing how Bardia had approached Alfie and attacked him in public, in front of witnesses. They pointed to the deliberate act of bringing a knife to school grounds. The defense argued that Bardia was still just a child, overwhelmed by teenage conflicts, and not fully grasping the weight of his actions. They suggested that immaturity and peer pressures played a role. But the jury, after hearing the testimony of witnesses and reviewing the evidence, found him guilty. In 2024, Bardia Shojaeifard was sentenced to life detention, with a minimum term of 13 years before he could even be considered for release. That means he will be well into adulthood before parole is possible. The judge, in handing down the sentence, stressed the seriousness of carrying knives and the devastation caused by such crimes. For Alfie's family, the sentence brought a measure of justice, but not peace. His mother described him as a boy who had so much ahead of him, whose laughter once filled their home, and whose absence is now an unending grief. For the city of Leeds, the case became a symbol of the urgent need to address youth violence. Schools, parents, and community leaders have since renewed calls for education and prevention around knife crime, hoping to prevent another tragedy like Alfie's. And so, the story circles back to that November afternoon. Two boys, the same age, met outside a school. One carried a knife. The other never made it home. Today, Bardia Shojaeifard sits behind bars, beginning a sentence that will define much of his young life. Alfie Lewis is remembered in photographs, in memorials, and in the hearts of those who loved him. The question that lingers is stark. How does a disagreement between teenagers end with a life lost forever? Number 4. Hassan Sentamu. It was just after 8:30 in the morning on a busy street in Croydon, South London. Commuters were rushing to work, parents were walking their children to school, and teenagers were gathering at bus stops. Among them was 15-year-old Eliane Andam, dressed smartly in her school uniform, chatting with friends. In the blink of an eye, that ordinary start to the day collapsed into chaos. Witnesses described screams, panic, and the sudden realization that a child had just been attacked in full view of the public. The boy responsible was 17-year-old Hassan Sentamu. To those who knew him, he was another teenager navigating adolescence in London. Social media, school pressures, friendships, and occasional run-ins with authority. He had no celebrity status, no public platform, but what he did in September 2023 would make his name infamous. Eliane Andam, by contrast, was remembered as bright, kind, and ambitious. Friends said she dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Her teachers praised her work ethic, and her family described her as someone who always carried herself with maturity beyond her years. On September 27th, she boarded a bus to school like so many others. She would never make it to class. The events began with a confrontation. Hassan, who was carrying a large knife hidden in his clothing, was reportedly angry over a personal dispute involving friends and social tensions that had been simmering. Elian, by tragic chance, became part of that morning's encounter. At the Croydon bus stop, Hassan pulled the knife. In a moment that left bystanders frozen, he stabbed Elian in the neck. Imagine the horror of those standing nearby. Commuters on their way to work, students waiting for buses, mothers holding the hands of younger children. Elian collapsed on the pavement. Despite immediate efforts by paramedics and members of the public, her injuries were fatal. At just 15 years old, her life ended on a sidewalk in the morning rush hour. The response was immediate. Police swarmed the area, detaining Hassan within the hour. The knife was recovered, and witnesses lined up to give statements. Shock rolled across London, and within hours the news spread nationally. A schoolgirl had been killed in broad daylight. Vigils followed. Outside Elian's school, flowers piled high. Politicians spoke about the crisis of knife crime. For her family, though, all of the public discussion could not blunt the raw grief of losing a daughter so suddenly. Investigators moved quickly. Surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony, and forensic evidence left little doubt about who had carried out the attack. The key questions became why and with what intent. Prosecutors pointed to the fact that Hassan had armed himself before leaving home that day. Carrying a knife wasn't a split-second decision. It was preparation. The randomness of Elian's death, she wasn't the intended target of a feud, but an innocent victim, made the case even more devastating. In court, the prosecution painted a picture of a teenager who chose to carry a deadly weapon and then used it in public, knowing the potential consequences. The defense attempted to highlight his youth, his immaturity, and the impulsive nature of teenage conflicts. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified to seeing the attack. Medical experts described the fatal wound, and the jury heard about the planning that went into carrying the knife in the first place. By March 2025, the verdict was clear. Hassan Sentamu was found guilty of killing Elian Andam. The judge handed down a life sentence with a minimum term of 23 years before he can even be considered for parole. That means Hassan, who was 17 at the time of the crime, will spend the bulk of his life behind bars. He will be middle-aged before he has any chance of release. For Elian's family, the sentence was a moment of accountability, but not closure. In emotional statements, they spoke about a young girl with dreams of becoming a lawyer, about her laughter at home, and about the empty seat now left at their table. Community leaders echoed their pain, calling Elian's death a turning point in the conversation around youth violence in London. And so, the story comes full circle. A teenager carrying a knife turned a school morning into a national tragedy. A 15-year-old girl, full of ambition, never made it to class. Now, Hassan Sentamu sits in prison, beginning a sentence that will define the course of his life. For Elian's family and community, the memory of that September morning lingers, an ordinary day that ended with extraordinary loss. Number 5. Sarah Grace Patrick. It was the middle of summer in a quiet Georgia town, July 2025. Neighbors heard what they thought were ordinary family sounds: a television running, the hum of an air conditioner, kids in the distance. But when the sun came up the next day, the Patrick home was sealed off with police tape. Inside, investigators found a crime that would leave even seasoned officers shaken. The person at the center of it wasn't a stranger or an intruder. It was 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick. On the surface, Sarah's life didn't look extraordinary. She was a high schooler with a social media presence, friends, and the usual teenage routines. But beneath that, tensions in her home had been building. Accounts later described family disputes, particularly between Sarah, her mother Christy, and her stepfather Christopher. Still, no one around her imagined she could be capable of crossing the line she did in July. Christy Patrick was described by relatives as a devoted mother, someone deeply involved in her children's lives. Christopher Patrick, her husband, was known locally as hardworking, the kind of man who kept his head down and provided for his family. Together, they were raising Sarah in what outwardly looked like a stable suburban home. But in the early hours of July 25th, that home became the scene of a double killing. Investigators allege that Sarah attacked both Christy and Christopher during the night. The exact sequence has not yet been fully revealed, as prosecutors are holding much of the detail for trial. What is known is that both were killed inside the home, and that Sarah was still present when officers arrived. Imagine the shock of first responders, expecting perhaps a burglary or a domestic dispute, only to discover that the teenager they found there was accused of ending her own parents' lives. Word spread quickly through the Georgia community. Neighbors gathered on the street, watching as officers moved in and out of the Patrick house. News crews soon followed, reporting that a 17-year-old had been arrested on suspicion of killing her mother and stepfather. Candlelight vigils appeared within days. People who knew Christy and Christopher described them as caring and dependable, baffled at how their lives had ended this way. The arrest was swift. Sarah was taken into custody and interviewed by detectives. From the start, the district attorney's office signaled they were treating the case with utmost seriousness. Because of the severity of the charges, she would not be handled in juvenile court. In late July 2025, Sarah Grace Patrick was formally charged as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder. That decision, trying a 17-year-old as an adult, ignited debate across Georgia. Supporters of the move pointed to the brutality of the allegations, saying age should not excuse accountability. Critics argued that at 17, Sarah was still legally a minor, and that questions about her mental health, maturity, and family dynamics should be weighed heavily. But the law was clear. For crimes of this magnitude, prosecutors had discretion to pursue adult charges, and they did. As the investigation unfolded, prosecutors began gathering evidence from the crime scene, electronics in the home, and interviews with friends and relatives. They are expected to argue at trial that Sarah acted with intent, planning the attack on her mother and stepfather. The defense, meanwhile, has hinted it may raise questions about Sarah's mental state, her emotional struggles, and the pressures inside the home. At this stage, however, the full strategy remains unknown. In court appearances since her arrest, Sarah has shown little emotion. Reporters in the room noted her quiet demeanor, her eyes cast down as prosecutors read the charges. Each hearing has drawn members of Christy and Christopher's extended family, who sit only feet away from the teenager accused of killing them. The tension is palpable, grieving relatives facing the very person now standing trial. The trial itself is scheduled for 2026, and it promises to be one of the most closely watched cases in the state. The stakes are enormous. If convicted of both counts, Sarah could face life imprisonment, possibly without parole. For a teenager who only just turned 17, that would mean spending the rest of her life in a cell. If the defense succeeds in reducing the charges or proving diminished capacity, the outcome could look very different. Until then, Sarah remains in custody, held without bond, awaiting her day in court. For the community, the case raises haunting questions. How does a teenager turn on the very people who raised her? What signs, if any, were missed? Could this tragedy have been prevented? These questions echo beyond the Patrick family, touching on broader debates about youth, responsibility, and the justice system. And so the story sits in an uneasy place. A mother and stepfather are gone. Their lives ended in their own home. A daughter sits in detention, facing charges that could ensure she never walks free again. The trial will eventually provide a verdict, but for now, the story is suspended in uncertainty. What began as a summer evening in Georgia ended as a case that shocked the nation. And the question that hangs in the air is simple, but impossible to answer fully. Why? Number 6. Jalen Lucas and Kelvin Thomas Jr. It was a cold January night in Washington, D.C., the kind of evening when the city is buzzing with commuters, students, and staffers making their way home. Among them was 21-year-old Eric Tarpinian Jakim, a young congressional intern with a promising future. He had come to the Capitol to learn, to work hard, and to take his first steps in public service. But in an instant, his life was taken, ended not by a personal grudge, but by a stray bullet on a city street. The two names tied to that bullet are Jalen Lucas and Kelvin Thomas Jr., both just 17 years old. Teenagers who, by early 2025, found themselves not in a classroom or sports team, but in police custody, facing the most serious charges the law can bring. Eric was remembered as ambitious, kind, and dedicated. His family spoke of a young man who believed in the ideals of government and public service. Friends described him as someone who was always ready to help, with a bright future that seemed within reach. On January 13, 2025, he was walking outside in Northwest D.C., not far from where he lived. It was supposed to be another ordinary evening, but elsewhere nearby, a different story was playing out. According to investigators, Lucas and Thomas had armed themselves with handguns and were targeting rivals in a local dispute. Police say the two opened fire on a street corner, intending to strike others. Instead, one of the bullets tore through the night and struck Eric. He collapsed on the sidewalk. Imagine the confusion of bystanders. He wasn't involved, not part of any feud, just a passerby suddenly caught in the middle of gunfire. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital, but the injuries were fatal. At just 21 years old, Eric's life ended. His dreams of shaping policy and working on Capitol Hill abruptly cut short. Detectives moved quickly. D.C. police canvassed the neighborhood, collected shell casings, and pulled surveillance footage. Within days, they identified suspects. The names that emerged shocked even those used to the realities of urban violence. Two 17-year-olds. Jalen Lucas and Kelvin Thomas Jr. were arrested later that month. Both were charged with first-degree murder while armed, as well as multiple related offenses tied to the shooting. The case immediately drew national attention. Not only had the victim been a young congressional intern, but the accused were children in the eyes of the law, though prosecutors wasted no time announcing they would be tried as adults. In D.C., as in many jurisdictions, crimes of this level of violence don't remain in juvenile court. In court filings, prosecutors described the shooting as reckless and deliberate. They argued that Lucas and Thomas chose to carry guns, chose to fire them on a public street, and in doing so caused the death of an innocent bystander. The defense has hinted it may push back on those claims, questioning whether both teens fired shots, whether the fatal bullet can be tied to one individual, and whether their age should weigh heavily in sentencing. But for now, the facts remain. Both 17-year-olds are charged. Both face the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in prison if convicted. Court appearances so far have been tense. Eric's family members have sat quietly in the gallery, listening as prosecutors detail the moments that led to his death. Lucas and Thomas have appeared in juvenile detention uniforms, flanked by defense attorneys. Their faces young, but their charges severe. Each hearing underscores the contrast, the life of a 21-year-old cut short, and the lives of two 17-year-olds hanging in the balance of the justice system. The trial is expected to unfold in 2026. Until then, prosecutors are building their case, using ballistic evidence, witness testimony, and digital records. Defense teams are preparing their for the city of Washington. The case is both familiar and shocking. Familiar because stray bullet killings tied to youth violence are sadly not rare. Shocking because the victim wasn't just another statistic. He was someone who had come to the Capitol to contribute to government, to learn, and to build a future. His death has already sparked renewed debate about youth access to guns and the cycle of violence pulling children into adult crimes. And so the story rests in limbo. Eric Tarpinian Jacom's family grieves a son who left for an internship and never came home. Two teenagers sit behind bars awaiting trial, their futures now defined by what happens in a courtroom. The trial will decide whether they spend decades, or even their entire lives, in prison. But for Eric's family, no verdict will bring back the young man who should have had decades ahead of him. On that January night, a bullet meant for someone else found him instead. And with that single shot, 3 young lives were forever changed. Number 7. Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe. She was just 16, a teenager with her whole life ahead of her. Brianna Gay was known for her bold personality, her love of fashion, and her strong presence on social media. Friends described her as vibrant, someone who made others laugh, and a girl who wasn't afraid to be herself. But on a February afternoon in 2023, Brianna's life was cut short in a crime that horrified the UK, not only because of its brutality, but because of who carried it out, 2 of her peers, both just 15 at the time. The killers were Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe. On the surface, they were ordinary Warrington teenagers. They went to school, hung out with friends, and lived lives that didn't draw much outside attention. But beneath that, the pair were carrying something darker. Their messages, later revealed in court, showed a fascination with violence, with planning, and with testing boundaries in ways that seemed chillingly detached from reality. On February 11, 2023, Brianna agreed to meet up with them at Colchith Linear Park, a wooded area in Warrington. For Brianna, it seemed like a casual outing with people she knew. But Jenkinson and Ratcliffe had other intentions. They had planned the attack in advance, bringing with them the knife that would take her life. Imagine Brianna walking into the park that afternoon, wind in the trees, the sound of kids playing in the distance. The kind of ordinary weekend setting where nothing sinister should happen. Yet in that moment, she was stepping into a trap. The 2 teenagers turned on her. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Within minutes, Brianna collapsed, fatally wounded. Passers-by found her and raised the alarm. Emergency services rushed to the scene, but it was too late. At just 16, Brianna was gone. News spread quickly. A teenager had been killed in a local park. The community's shock only deepened when police announced they had arrested not an adult stranger, but 2 classmates, both just 15 years old. The investigation peeled back the disturbing details. Text messages between Jenkinson and Ratcliffe showed weeks of planning. They discussed weapons, possible victims, and even the idea of killing for the thrill of it. Prosecutors later said the killing wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated. Brianna had been deliberately lured into the park, targeted by people she thought she could trust. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw transcripts of the pair's conversations, which revealed a fascination with violence and a chilling lack of empathy. Witnesses testified about their demeanor, and investigators presented the knife as the murder weapon. Jenkinson was portrayed as the driving force, the one who pushed for the plan and encouraged carrying it out. Ratcliffe, though less forceful, was still fully involved, joining in and making no attempt to stop what unfolded. The trial, held in late 2023, gripped the nation. Questions were raised about how 2 teenagers could descend into such cold planning, and what could have prevented it. The defense tried to argue issues of immaturity, mental health, and vulnerability. But the jury was not convinced. In December 2023, both Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe were found guilty of killing Brianna Gay. In January 2024, sentencing was handed down. Jenkinson received a life sentence with a minimum of 22 years before parole could even be considered. Ratcliffe received life with a 20-year minimum. For teenagers who had only just turned 16, the sentences meant they would be middle-aged adults before ever having a chance at release. The judge described their crime as one of shocking cruelty, emphasizing the careful planning that had led to Brianna's death. For Brianna's family, the verdict brought some accountability but no healing. They spoke of her as a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone whose life was stolen in a way no parent should have to face. Her mother, in particular, became a visible figure in the aftermath, reminding the country that Brianna was more than just a headline. She was a teenager with dreams and a future that will never be realized. The case left a lasting mark on Warrington and the wider UK. It forced conversations about youth violence, about how young people can be drawn into dark obsessions, and about the role of online spaces where disturbing fantasies can take root. Schools, parents, and communities looked inward, asking what signs had been missed and how another tragedy like this could be prevented. And so, the story closes where it began. A 16-year-old girl with her life ahead of her, betrayed by two peers she should have been able to trust. Today, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe sit behind bars, serving life sentences for a crime they planned when they were barely out of childhood themselves. Brianna's absence still weighs heavy. Her memory carried in vigils, tributes, and the lives of those who loved her. The lingering question remains: how did teenagers with so much still ahead of them turn so deliberately toward destruction? Number 8. Jyquest Williams. On a warm summer evening in Syracuse, New York, 2024, two groups of teenagers crossed paths near a neighborhood park. Among them was 15-year-old Alexia Lynch, a girl described by her family as cheerful, ambitious, and deeply loved. What should have been another summer night of hanging out with friends ended in tragedy when gunfire broke the calm. Within moments, Alexia was on the ground, struck by a bullet. She would not survive. The person responsible was another teenager, 15-year-old Jyquest Williams. To his peers, he was known as restless and sometimes confrontational. Like many young teens in tough environments, he was drawn into disputes and pressures that seemed far larger than his years. But what happened that night went beyond arguments or teenage bravado. It was an act that ended one life and changed another forever. Alexia, just like him, was 15. She was full of energy and dreams, her family later saying she had hopes of pursuing higher education and building a career. Friends remembered her kindness and her habit of lifting others up. Her red hair and wide smile made her instantly recognizable in a crowd. She had gone out that night like any teenager, expecting fun, not danger. The confrontation that led to her death started small. Witnesses told police that an argument between groups of teens had escalated. Harsh words were exchanged, tempers rose, and then Williams pulled out a gun. Imagine standing there in that moment, expecting nothing more than teenage chatter, only to see a firearm appear in a 15-year-old's hand. The decision came fast. Williams fired, and in the chaos that followed, Alexia was hit. Neighbors rushed outside at the sound of shots. Emergency services were called immediately, and Alexia was taken to the hospital. But despite doctors' efforts, the wound was fatal. Syracuse had lost another child to gun violence, and this time the killer was a child too. Police acted quickly. Witnesses identified Williams, and within days, he was arrested. The weapon was recovered, and investigators pieced together the timeline. Prosecutors emphasized one key fact: he had chosen to bring a gun to a teenage dispute. That decision alone transformed a quarrel into a killing. The community reaction was swift and emotional. Vigils were held in Alexia's honor. Friends released balloons in her memory, her family speaking through tears about the daughter they would never see graduate, never see grow into adulthood. For Syracuse, it was another painful reminder of how easily youth disputes can turn deadly when firearms are involved. By the time the case reached court in early 2025, Williams had turned 16. He was charged as an adult with second-degree murder and weapons possession. In the courtroom, the contrast was striking. A boy barely old enough to drive, facing the possibility of decades in prison. Prosecutors outlined the sequence of events, stressing how deliberate his choice was to fire a gun during a crowded confrontation. The defense argued that he was immature, swept up in teenage impulsiveness, and never intended to kill anyone. The jury, however, sided with the prosecution. In April 2025, Jyquest Williams was convicted of murder. The judge handed down a sentence of 14 years to life. That means Williams will not be eligible for parole until he is nearly 30 years old, and he could remain behind bars for the rest of his life if parole is denied. For Alexia's family, the verdict brought accountability, but little comfort. At her memorial, her mother spoke of the milestones Alexia will never reach: prom, college, a family of her own. Her friends continue to post tributes online, keeping her memory alive in photos and words. For them, the 14-to-life sentence is a reminder that while Williams will someday have a chance at freedom, Alexia never will. And so, the story leaves us with a harsh reality. Two teenagers, both 15, both with their whole lives in front of them, collided on a summer night. One chose to carry a gun, one became an innocent victim, and now both lives are defined by that single choice. In Syracuse, the echoes of that night still linger, proof of how quickly youthful conflict can spiral into permanent loss. Number 9. Logan MacPhail. It was a cold January evening in Hexham, a quiet market town in Northumberland. Teenagers were milling about after school, shops were closing, and the town center buzzed with its usual hum. Among them was 15-year-old Holly Newton. She was out with friends, laughing, walking the same streets she'd passed countless times before. But this night would end differently. Waiting nearby was someone she once trusted, her ex-boyfriend, 16-year-old Logan MacPhail, and in his pocket he carried a knife. Holly was remembered as bright, caring, and full of promise. She loved art, music, and dreamed of what life beyond secondary school might hold. Friends and teachers spoke of her kindness, her laughter, and her ambition. Her parents later described her as the heart of their family. To them, Holly was not just a daughter, but a best friend. Logan MacPhail had been her boyfriend until recently. Their relationship, like many teenage romances, had its ups and downs. But when Holly decided to end it, Logan did not let go. He grew increasingly angry and possessive. Friends noticed his jealousy, his frustration, and the way he talked about her after the breakup. By January 2023, that anger had hardened into something darker. On the evening of January 27th, Holly was walking with friends in Hexham Town Center. Logan approached them. What began as an argument escalated quickly. Witnesses said Logan's demeanor was cold, his words sharp. And then, in a move that stunned everyone present, he pulled out a knife. Imagine standing there. One moment it's just teenagers arguing, the next a weapon is out, and the situation has turned deadly. Logan stabbed Holly, and in the chaos, another teenage boy was injured trying to intervene. People screamed, calling for help. Passers-by rushed forward, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Emergency services arrived within minutes, and Holly was rushed to hospital. But despite their efforts, she died that night from her injuries. She was just 15 years old. Police quickly identified Logan as the attacker. He fled briefly but was found and arrested not long after. The knife was recovered and he was taken into custody. News of Holly's death spread fast, shocking Hexham and rippling across the UK. A vigil was held in the town square where classmates lit candles, placed flowers, and remembered the girl whose life had been stolen in such a public and brutal way. The investigation revealed chilling details. Logan had carried the knife deliberately. Messages and behavior leading up to the attack showed his anger over the breakup. Prosecutors later said this was not a sudden loss of control, but a planned act of violence. He had left home that day with the weapon and the intention to confront Holly. The trial began in 2024. By then, Logan had turned 17. Prosecutors outlined how he had stalked Holly in the days before the stabbing, waiting for the chance to confront her. They highlighted the deliberate decision to carry the knife and the escalation from threats to deadly action. Witnesses, friends who had been with Holly that night, recounted the moments leading up to the stabbing, their voices cracking under the weight of memory. The defense argued that Logan was still a child, immature, and overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't manage. They claimed the attack was spontaneous, the tragic result of a heated teenage argument. But the jury saw otherwise. In November 2024, Logan MacPhail was convicted. The judge handed him a life sentence with a minimum of 17 years before parole could be considered. That means Logan will spend his entire youth and much of his adulthood in prison. He will be in his 30s before the possibility of release is even raised. For Holly's family, the sentencing provided accountability, but not closure. They spoke in court of the hole left in their lives, of birthdays and milestones that would forever pass without her. Her school community remembered her with memorials, murals, and tributes, determined to keep her spirit alive. For them, Holly will always be the girl with a ready smile, full of dreams never realized. And so, the story circles back to a January evening in Hexham. A teenage breakup, the kind of thing that happens every day, became the catalyst for violence. One teenager is gone, another spends his life behind bars, and a community is left carrying the weight of a loss that should never have happened. The lingering question is as simple as it is painful. How did heartbreak turn into something so final? Number 10. Carly Madison Gregg. It was a spring evening in March 2024 in rural Mississippi, the kind of quiet night when families settled in after long days. But inside one household, silence was broken by gunfire. When deputies arrived, they found a mother dead, a stepfather wounded, and a 15-year-old girl accused of pulling the trigger. That girl was Carly Madison Gregg. Carly had grown up in Mississippi, known to classmates as a reserved teenager. On the surface, she was like many high schoolers, active on social media, balancing classes, and navigating the turbulent years of adolescence. But inside her family home, tensions were mounting. Accounts later revealed frequent arguments, disciplinary struggles, and growing resentment between Carly, her mother, and her stepfather. These disputes simmered for months, but no one expected them to end in bloodshed. Her mother, 40-year-old Ashley Smiley, was described by friends as warm, nurturing, and fiercely devoted to her family. Ashley had built a life with her husband, Heath, creating what neighbors thought was a stable home. Heath, a steady presence, worked hard and was respected in the community. Together, they seemed to embody a picture of small-town family life. But on the night of March 19, 2024, everything changed. According to investigators, Carly retrieved a firearm from inside the home. The details of what triggered her actions remain partly sealed in court records, but prosecutors said it was not an accident. With Ashley and Heath inside the house, Carly opened fire. Ashley was struck fatally while Heath was hit but survived. Imagine the shock of a father figure, realizing in an instant that the teenager he helped raise had turned the weapon on him and his wife. Neighbors recalled hearing sudden bangs and then seeing flashing lights as emergency responders arrived. Deputies secured Carly at the scene, taking her into custody. Ashley was pronounced dead. Heath was rushed to the hospital, where he began the long road of recovery. In one night, a family was destroyed from within. News of the shooting spread quickly across Mississippi. The idea of a 15-year-old accused of killing her own mother and attempting to kill her stepfather stunned the community. Candlelight vigils were held for Ashley, where loved ones described her as selfless and strong, the center of her family's world. For many, the hardest part to accept was that the accused wasn't an intruder or stranger. It was her own daughter. Prosecutors moved decisively. Carly was charged as an adult with first-degree murder for her mother's death and attempted murder for the shooting of her stepfather. In Mississippi, the severity of the crime allowed the case to bypass juvenile court. From the beginning, the district attorney's office made clear they would pursue the maximum penalties. The trial unfolded over the summer of 2024. Prosecutors presented evidence that Carly acted with intent, deliberately retrieving the gun and firing at both Ashley and Heath. Witnesses recounted the family tensions and the arguments that had become more frequent in the months leading up to the shooting. Heath himself testified, describing the moment his wife was struck down and how he narrowly survived. His words carried weight. He was both a victim and a father figure who now had to testify against the girl he had helped raise. The defense argued Carly's youth should be central, painting her as a troubled teenager incapable of fully grasping the weight of her actions. They hinted at emotional struggles and the volatility of adolescence. But the jury, after hearing the evidence, rejected those claims. They found her guilty. In September 2024, the sentence was announced. Carly Madison Gregg was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. At just 15 years old, she joined the small but chilling list of juveniles in the United States serving life without parole sentences. The judge emphasized the deliberate nature of the crime and the devastation it caused, stating that the punishment reflected the seriousness of taking a parent's life and nearly ending another's. For Ashley's family, the sentence brought accountability, but not healing. Her friends and relatives spoke of the deep loss of a mother, daughter, and friend who had been central to so many lives. For Heath, the road forward is marked not only by his physical recovery, but by the emotional weight of losing his wife and seeing his stepdaughter imprisoned for life. And so, the story comes full circle. A Mississippi home that once held ordinary family routines became the scene of an unthinkable crime. A mother is gone. A stepfather carries scars, both physical and emotional. And a teenager now spends her life behind bars with no hope of release. The lingering question is one that cannot be answered in a courtroom. How does conflict within a family escalate so far that a child raises a gun against her own mother?